20th Party Congress, I think, is the biggest geopolitical event of the year and the biggest macro event of the year, maybe of a few decades, because China being the second largest economy, let's see what they talk about in their 5-year plans and what they tell you about their policies going forward. I think it's a very, very important milestone for the global economy, and there hasn't been a lot of headlines. So what I did was I asked Chris to put in the description to the video today of the entire transcript of Xi's speech. It's a 2-hour speech, and I was going to try to pull out a few quotes from that, but it was too long, and there wasn't any specific spot that I could pull out that made sense out of context. But I do want to say that they used the term Marxism like 26 times in there. They used the term distribution or redistribution of income, all of these Marxist calling cards. So for anybody that doesn't think that China is truly Marxist and communist, just go read Xi's speech there. And I mean, it drips off the page with Marxist Leninist stuff. I mean, he says those exact words, that China is a Marxist Leninist country. So anyway, I do have some quotes, however, from a Blackrock blog post. And I think that's the next slide up, Chris. So this is just a blog post from a couple days ago on the Blackrock website. So this is going out to Blackrock clients. These high-powered investors, high net worth individuals are reading this blog. And the title is China's Growth Challenges Go Beyond COVID. If you go to the next slide, what I did was I pulled out a few quotes. And I think this is very important, so I'm just going to read these out here. China's export growth has already been slowing markedly since July. We think the volume of exports could actually shrink by 6% on average in 2022 and 2023, translating into nominal export growth of just 3%. So let that sink in. The volume of exports out of China are going to decrease 6% this year and next year. That's 12% total, roughly. And nominally, yes, there's slight growth, but the volume of it, people are cutting China out of the global economy. Let me continue. So instead of making a positive contribution to overall economic growth of 1.8% in 2020 and 2021, exports could make a negative contribution of 1.1% this year and next. And then see the chart. So if you go to the chart, actually, Chris, it's in the next slide. So you can see that 1.8% is adding to growth, and then they have this 1.1% negative. So to make up the difference, what they're saying is there needs to be domestic demand growth. There needs to be productivity growth in China, and we're not seeing that. If you can go back, slide number 7, Chris. All right, so continuing. Losing that huge growth driver will make maintaining overall economic growth quite the challenge. All else equal, economic growth next year would have to be a substantial 2.9% slower overall. Given the loss of export demand, the only way to achieve a steady growth rate of 5%, roughly in line with the authorities' target in 2022 and 2023, would be to almost double the growth rate of domestic demand. That could change afterwards, but we shouldn't expect too much. Sorry, I'm having a small print. I can't see it too well. Why we don't expect a major change in the political landscape, and the current authorities have shown themselves to be pretty cautious about implementing policies to boost growth, unlike their predecessors who went all out during the financial crisis. In recent years, the government has typically aimed for the minimum possible support, as it worries about pro-growth policies resulting in too much debt, artificially inflated asset prices, or greater income inequality. When facing a trade-off between growth today and risks that could have a big effect tomorrow, the government has prioritized future stability. So what this is saying is, they just don't have, everything is lining up against them. They have a very high debt. It's actually the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world if you include public and private debt. They have the worst demographics in the world, which we'll get into here in a second. And they have this inflation problem. So there is, their currency is weakening. So they have all of these things they cannot stimulate. Yet that's where all their growth is supposed to come from. And I want to reiterate, this is BlackRock, the BlackRock blog, who I don't particularly like BlackRock in the grand scheme of things, but I understand that there are big heavyweights in the world, and this is coming straight from their blog. So if we could go to slide number 9, please. Well, let me stop there. CK, do you have anything to add or anything you thought about that section before I get to the next section?
No, nothing in particular. I love to chime in now. We've been early about talking about what is wrong with China. While a lot of people say China is the new rising power, even earlier this year, for over a year, maybe even 2, we've been pointing out the issues with a state and country that identifies as Leninist and communist. And how that will not be able to compete against a market system. So the fact that a BlackRock, which I think for the most part has been kind of aligned with a pro Chinese thesis, is now turning around. I think that is really telling, because that's when, all support kind of goes away and people really accept that there's some issues here. And frankly, just seeing how the CCP is kind of acting and prolonging COVID when the rest of the world has kind of given into normalcy for the most part, it's affected their ability to export, which the world is just going to route around that. There's a lot of countries that are willing and able to take that production mantle on. Obviously, it's not easy to just pick up and go, but it's already been a trend, and that trend can just accelerate.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the next one, slide number 9. So more fundamentally, the authorities don't have as much room to boost growth aggressively, even if they wanted to. Previous periods of slower growth, like in 2000, 2008, and 2015, came alongside rapidly increasing productive capacity, which drove inflation down. That's not the case this time, which suggests that China's potential output, the amount it can produce before inflation starts to surge, is lower now. COVID controls are reducing potential output today. While they might be eased, we still think the potential growth rate of the Chinese economy might have fallen below 5% and could fall further. Sorry, motorcycle drove by. Could fall further around 3% by the turn of the decade. Now, I'll add here that no, it's by the turn of the decade, if the exports are dropping 6% a year in volume, there's no way they're going to keep a 3% growth rate, even for the next 2 years. So by the end of the decade, I think we're going to see that in the next 2 years. Why? They ask why. Most importantly, the working age population, having grown rapidly, is now shrinking. And we'll see a chart here in a second. Fewer workers mean the economy cannot produce as much without generating inflation, unless productivity growth accelerates. But we think international trade and tech restrictions, as well as tighter regulations on companies operating in China, will dampen productivity growth. So now let's go to the next slide. And this is just a chart of the working age population. And you can see in 2020, it went below 0. And there's a little spike up here about 2025, but then it drops very negative. And this is the fastest shrinking population in the history of the world. They are going to get old way before they get rich. So very important demographics. The demographics is working against them. Okay, next slide. Now this is the conclusion of this blog post. So putting all this together, we don't think China policymakers will take aggressive measures to boost growth. It's possible the removal of COVID controls could give a bigger than expected boost if it happens more quickly, but there's no clear indication of pace yet. Looking through the COVID ups and downs, we think the slowing demand and grudging policy offsets as supply growth slows means growth will average significantly below pre-pandemic rates in coming years. That will have knock-on effect on the rest of the world. In the past, when countries faced a slowdown, they could still rely on Chinese consumers and companies to buy up their cars, chemicals, machinery, fuel, even as consumers at home tighten their belts. And they could rely on China to continue supplying an abundance of cheap products as China's rapidly growing working population enabled it to keep production costs low. Not so anymore. Recession is looming now for the US, UK, and Europe, but this time China won't be coming to its own or anyone else's rescue. So that is the blog post from Blackrock. Any closing thoughts before we move on to Michael Pettis?
It is interesting to kind of hear about how this is going to affect the U.S. and other nations. Obviously, China has been a massive force in the global economy for a long time, pretty much the entire all of the 2000s, and so the last 20 years or so. But I know that you kind of have some theories there, why that's good for the U.S., why that's good for localism, why that's good for other developing nations. But in the immediate term, it's going to have some pains. Ansel, what are you gonna say?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily good for those things. I think that it will lead to those things, inevitably. So I think that the way that the market is going, the way that the world is going, the way that human society and the global economy is evolving is beyond anyone's control. And I mean, it doesn't matter how we feel about it, right? It is going to happen. We're going to a multipolar world, if you can call it that, or a multi-regional world. And that will have spill-on, knock-on effects towards localism and also towards trust minimizing currency, which is one of the big bids under Bitcoin. Trade between these regions, these powers aren't going to trust each other. Well, you need a currency that is trusted, that embodies that trust, so that there can be trade between these regional powers in the world. They're not going to accept credit. Okay, China's credit is not going to be good in the US or Europe. Russian credit definitely isn't going to be good in Europe. So there's, these regional powers need a neutral currency to trade with, and that is part of Bitcoin's story for sure. But let's move on real quick. Did you have something else to add? No.
Nope,
okay.
Let's move on. I agree.
Yep. All right, we're running short on time, so we're probably not going to be able to get to the European stuff. Maybe we can touch on it briefly before we
can do it. 12 more minutes. Let's go.
We have to bounce. Okay, so this is Michael Pettis, and he is. If you guys aren't following on Twitter, make sure you follow Michael Pettis. I can't remember his handle. I think it's Michael X Pettis or something like that on Twitter, and he is a professor at Beijing University, I believe. Pretty well-known and well-established economist that's working over there in China. And I just love the stuff that he puts out. But here, this is what a tweet thread he put out about what's happening here between provincial governments or regional governments and the CCP in Beijing. So he's quoting from an article, and he says, quote, "The Ministry of Finance said government-backed entities would be strictly prohibited from purchasing land by raising debt last week, describing the practice as a sham," end quote. The Ministry of Finance is right, of course, but this doesn't address the original problem. Allowing local governments to reverse the decline in land sales revenue by setting up SPVs to buy land from themselves was simply a way for them to borrow money and pretend the proceeds were actually land sale revenues. This was extremely risky because, among other things, it meant that the local governments were effectively doubling down on their already excessive exposure to the real estate market. The Ministry of Finance was absolutely right to clamp down on this practice. Next slide. But local governments are desperate. Their revenues have dropped sharply, even as their expenses have risen. What is more, they are expected to fund a wave of growth next year. The Ministry of Finance stopped them from faking revenues without addressing the reasons they had to do so. Beijing must know how difficult the circumstances are that local governments face, and yet isn't doing much to help. I think we are probably seeing the beginning of what over the next few years will be a very contentious relationship between local governments and Beijing. And I'll say that his analysis here agrees with what the Blackrock was saying, is that they don't have room to do stimulus. All they're doing is they're clamping down on these faulty accounting practices, but not addressing the underlying issue. And they probably won't. And so Michael Pettis here this is a big statement saying that there's going to be a contentious relationship between local governments and Beijing. Now, the history of China does not like contentious relationships between local governments and the ruling power. You know, the most of the history is warring states. It's rare to have a consolidated China. And so that's one thing I've been saying too, that the risk of kind of revolution is not zero over there. And Michael Pettis is saying that right here. I mean, he might not have intended to say that, but that's what I think people that are at least amateur students of history will read that statement and be like, oh, damn, there's some risk of China actually having social upheaval. So what do you think of what Michael Pettis there said?
Very interesting. There's already been social upheaval. There's been a lot of social upheaval already. And we don't even see the majority of it. But it's happened with these banks. It's happened with people not wanting to repay their loans. It's happened with people saying that they're not going to make their payments on the real estate that they're waiting to get built that's not getting built. We're seeing on social media people like using humor to get around the CCP censorship. Obviously there's a black market for Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin itself in China. So I think we've already seen social upheaval, and it's likely just to get worse. But again, this is kind of the problem with like these mandated growth from governments, these expectations with socialism. It just does not work. So it's going to create contention. And I think people are going to look fondly at the days when markets were a little bit more free to operate in China and ask, why are we doing this?